Well, I know Keith appreciated your contributions because as much as we all love Emerson, Lake and Palmer, it was important to him to have some high quality non-ELP material on it too, just for the sake of variety. And it's not like ELP wasn't well represented. When Keith was here, I played your new version of Fanfare for the Common Man, and he commented that he particularly enjoyed the interplay between his keys and your guitar, but I actually ended up fading the track before it got to that part, for the sake of your record sales. I didn't want to give the whole thing away. But what I'm thinking now is, since we played the first half on his episode, I don't see why we can't play the second half on yours. And, we mentioned Troy Luccketta. I think he really does a great job drumming, really on the whole album in general, but particularly noticeable on this one with the shuffle and everything. And, playing with an orchestra is a new experience enough, but it has to be intimidating for any drummer to be asked to fill the shoes of Carl Palmer.
That's true, and the thing is with Troy is, he and I, worked together since Double E Ticket, and I was always pulling him into projects that he didn't think he could do. Yeah. I remember when I asked him to do Double E Ticket, he says, "Why don't you get a real drummer to do this stuff?" And I said, "You are a real drummer." He's always been able to grab a hold of an opportunity and immerse himself in it. He's the prime poster child for doing what scares the shit out of you. That's what he does, and he embraces it with both hands. He was asking Tade more questions, and Tade was very gracious. He answered every one of them, man. He just, once he gets into it, it's like he bites it like a terrier, and he goes in and always comes out with shining tracks, With Fanfare, it was great, because that was the first track that he said, okay, we didn't have to, we didn't play that with an orchestra. We just played it with a brass section. So we were able to finally, after all the other stuff was over with, to open up and just rock. Yeah. And so we did that with no click track, nothing. We didn't do anything with click track, actually. And so you're hearing a very liberated Troy Luccketta playing that track. That's why I think it comes off the way that it does.
Nice. Keith also told us that you and he were both expecting to play it in the key of C, but I guess the brass, they had it in B flat. So.
Well, yeah, because Copeland wrote it in B flat. I don't know what he was thinking, but anyway, yeah, he wrote it in B flat, and ELP always played it in C. And apparently, I guess that memo got misplaced somewhere, and Keith is waiting to do it in C. He's like, wait a minute, we're starting this thing in B. He's like, what's going on? And he says, they're doing it in the concert key.
Yeah, well, how many thousands of times since the '70s has he performed that thing? I mean, I can see how it would throw him for a loop, but as he pointed out, he can adjust the keyboard so he can play it in C, but it turns out sounding like B flat. So
yeah, it's true, but it's still, it's like when you're used to a certain color, and even though you're playing it in the same pattern, it's you're calling it red, it's still blue. It's odd, and you do have to get used to it because any color conveys a frequency and an emotion. Mm-hmm. And so it was a bit interesting, but we did it and it was fine, and that way the purists don't get mad. The classical purists won't get mad. Like, what are you doing this in C for? I can understand ELP may do it in C, but no, you don't do Copeland in C when he wrote it in B flat.
Yeah, so, horn players love B flat. I used to jam with a saxophone guy. He wanted me to play everything in B flat. It didn't matter what it was.
Yeah, that's C for them.
It is.
So it was it was great. And the great thing about that tune too is the percussionists who came by the last day we were there. We wanted a percussion bed under that, and we didn't have anything written out. We just said, hey, man, let's go up there and let's try a few things. And they were so happy, man. They were just like, well, we get to jam? It's like, yeah, and they actually felt great because they were able to contribute some of their own self to it. They weren't having to read anything. Yeah. And we stayed there all afternoon trying different things, and they left like walking on air because they were actually able to give of themselves to the track. Which, not that they hadn't before with the other stuff, but this they truly created. And it was very cool.
Yeah, that's
something
like
that classical players don't often get a chance to do.
No, that's why a lot of people travel from town to town and just use whatever orchestra is around because you can drop the music in front of them and they're pretty much all going to do it the same. That's what they're used to.
Right, which floored us to death. We, anytime that we, us as rock players, we come in and they just sit the music down, and just play, and we're just marveled by that. I mean, I can read music, but not to the degree that they can read it, and then they're completely blown away that we memorized everything. They're going, how do you do that? So we were both fans of each other, and that was one of the things that really spoke on the album, the fact that we both dug each other's stuff, and we both were impressed by each other's abilities to do what we, couldn't do. really.
well, it's win-win-win because as a listener who wasn't there, I can tell you that I love listening to it. And speaking of that, let's do what I said earlier and just pick the thing up in the middle and hear what Keith was talking about. From the Three Fates Project, we now join Fanfare for the Common Man, already in progress. Next, I want to talk about the Keith Emerson Band CD that you recorded back in 2008. But before we do that, can you tell us how and where and when you first met Keith Emerson?
Yeah, it was, I was in a bar in Almaden, which is part of San Jose, California. I was in a band called JC and the Twisters with Dave Nolan on bass and Don Frank on drums, and we had just gotten through playing White Noise. I had just written it, and I was doing demos with Ronnie Montrose. He was producing me, and we had just finished writing this tune, and I wanted to try it out with as a three-piece. So we played it, and as we were playing it, I look at the back of the club, and I see this guy standing there. Looks a lot like Keith Emerson. He's quite a ways away, and I'm like, oh, that guy looks like Keith Emerson. But why would Keith Emerson be in a pub in Almaden, California? So. And he was just back there with his arms folded and just watching, and we finished and took a break, and he comes up, and I swear to God, it is Keith Emerson, and he comes right up to me and introduces himself as if he needed to, and he said, "What was that last tune you played?" And I said, "It was White Noise." He says, "You wrote that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Have you recorded it yet?" And I said, "Well, not yet. We're planning on it, And he goes, "Do you mind if I play piano on it?" And I'm like, "You're joking me. You want to put, and the only thing I could think of to say was, well, what have you done? As a joke, because I was too blown away to say sure,
Right.
And he starts going, well, I was in a band called The Nice, and then I had a band called EOP. I said, dude, I know who you are. That was a joke. Yes, I would like for you to play piano on it, and And he said that he was there. I asked him what he was doing in San Jose area. He says, "Well, I'm doing an album with Kevin Gilbert, who's producing it. We're looking for a guitar player. Would you be interested in coming?" I'm like, "Duh." You know, and so he says, "Well, look, let's go. We're going water skiing tomorrow. Why don't you come out water skiing with us, and we'll talk about it." So, you know, the next day I'm sitting here water skiing with Keith Emerson. It was a very weird, surreal experience, you know.
Totally.
And we talked about it, and then the next day came down. I met Kevin Gilbert, and we hit it off real well. And we just did a whole album's worth of stuff, which I think became most of Changing States. I think that album with Keith, I think a lot of the stuff that we did was on that album. It was Michael Barsamanto on drums, Robert Berry, bass, and then Kevin produced, and I played guitar, and Keith played keys. Yeah. And from there, we would always bump into each other every so often. You know, I moved down to L.A., joined Toy Matinee, and we toured. You know, we were in Japan, and I would bump into Keith there. He was with the Best at the time, which was Entwistle and some other guys. I think Joe Walsh. And then, you know, we always, our paths would collide, and, you know, we kind of started thinking maybe somebody's trying to push us together for a reason, you know, and turns out there was a reason.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the Keith Emerson Band. You know, the material on that album, it's a nice mix of instrumentals and vocal tunes with plenty of opportunities for both you and Keith to shine on your instruments. Now, you've got a track called The Art of Falling Down that sounds a lot like a Black Moon era ELP song, or maybe even Emerson, Lake and Powell. You know, I like how you did one track that way, but not every track. You know, I think that was smart. I like Miles Away a lot, parts 1, 2, and 3. Keith had mentioned the importance of breaking up the seriousness with shots of humor now and then, so you got a track called Game Time that was written in that spirit. Were you doing a lot of co-writing with this material, or was it a case of you putting your stamp on each other's compositions?
Well, it was a little of both. You know, I remember the first piece that we did when we decided to do the album, and he asked me to produce it. I said, "Look, I'll produce this, but you got to understand, it's going to take me a while to get used to telling you what to do. You know, this is just going to be weird for me." So we had his whole rig set up here. You know, the organs, the synths, his big Moog was set up here, but everything in the studio. And he came in, and I believe the first piece he did was right after the initial ignition. Mm-hmm. There's a thing called, I think is it The Last Frontier? I'm thinking that's what it is. Anyway, it's the first thing. It's dum da da dum da da. It's that tune. Mm-hmm. And he did that, and I went, "This is great. This is exactly where it needs to go." Yeah, it was Last Horizon. That was the name of it. Okay. And I wanted to really make sure that the organ, the piano, and the Moog were what really worked on this album, because I was coming into this as an Emerson, Lake and Palmer fan, especially as a Keith Emerson fan. So I'm thinking, what do I as a fan want to hear? You know, I want to hear some pipe organ, man. I want to hear some, you know, I want to hear some healthy Hammond. You know, I want to hear, you know, not stock sounds, it's not stock patch sounds on a synth. You know, I want to hear the original Moog. And if we do modern synth stuff, I want to invent it, you know, which is what we did. So he would come in with one piece, and then it would spawn me to go, "Hey, I know what I want to do." And then I would come back, and I'd come back with a tune, and he'd look at me and go, "Busted," you know, go home and write something else and bring it. So we were like raising and calling each other. And then with a tune like Finale, he had a piece, and then I took it and I split it open, and I put a thing in the middle, of which spawned his creativity. So it was a little of both, where we would raise and call each other and spur each other to write more, and then we would come here, and then we would work out stuff in the middle together and lay it down, you know. So it was a real co-op.
Sounds like you're describing Lennon and McCartney. They did the same thing.
Yeah, in a way it was, you know. We would, yeah, it's exactly what it was.
Well, you're obviously a great guitar player and a great writer of music, but I wanted to be sure to play something showcasing your vocal ability, and the track I chose is called A Place to Hide. I not only like your singing on the track, I also like the song itself. It's got one of those choruses that sticks with you. Find it playing in my head a day or two later, you know. And I also like how Keith makes his presence felt every now and then, you know, with his tasteful fills, and like you said, his classic sounds, you know, without really intruding on the song. So, you know, it's very well done.
It was one of my favorite songs on the album. It was about a very dear friend of mine who passed away, and was my first adult friend as a kid. His name was Herb Lewis, and he he was a friend of my father's who was an artist, and he would come. He was the original Then Came Bronson guy who would just, he'd tour the world on a motorcycle and paint. And when he needed money, he would come back, work for my father for a few weeks, and bring me something. He taught me to play chess. He would take me hiking all the time. We went sketching, painting. And he never treated me like a kid. He was always, he was way older than I was, and just one of these guys that was a kindred spirit and had a great sense of humor. And, he finally passed away, and, so the song is really about, missing him at the table and all the adventures that he would talk about. And so it was very heartfelt for me, the tune. And what Keith added to that tune was just gorgeous. His piano figures that he would come up with, and the like you say, those fills that he did, and the Moog stuff at the end. It was perfect. Yeah. And that's my favorite song on the track, actually, or on the album. I'm glad that you liked the singing on it, because I felt every line of that.
Well, let's listen to it from their 2008 self-titled CD. This is the Keith Emerson Band with A Place to Hide.
At the table, telling how the world was round, fable after fable, lost and turned around, cold beneath the ground, laughing with the devils, skipping on the seas of chance, playing fields were level, till I got the news. If I could be near you, and if I could hear you, maybe these fears of mine would fall away. I need a place to hide, and I need a face to smile upon a frozen world, and that's all we ever had to be. Appeared out of the blue day, proved just how it all could fly. Shook hands with the shadows of doubt, held into the sky. Well, if I could see you, then I could free you, and maybe these cares in time would draw away. I need a place to hide,
in addition to that studio CD, in 2011 you also released a live CD and DVD of a performance you did in Moscow. Along with your new material, the set list also included ELP classics like Lucky Man, Carnival 9, and Bitches Crystal. I mentioned earlier Troy Luccketta having to be Carl Palmer. So what was it like for you having to be Greg Lake on those tunes?
Well, yeah, and I wasn't trying to be Greg. I was actively not trying to be Greg Lake in as much as singing, the lines that he sang. And I also, like at the beginning of Lucky Man, I completely rechanged the intro, almost where it wasn't as recognizable as what Greg did, because that's been done. I'm not going to do it like Greg did it. He did it in the way that it became very, very famous, and that's all good. But this is not me being Greg Lake. This is me being me. And so I thought, well, I better bring something else to it. What can I bring to it to make it, a different thing? Because ELP did it the way they did it. It's an icon song. I'm never going to do it like Greg Lake did it. It was just consummate the way that he did it. So let me do it the way I would do it now. So there's a whole thing with the EBO in the front of it with some loops and things that I would build on stage live, and and I try to make it emotional in that way, and then made it a lot harder at the end, so that it rocked more, because I felt I could bring those elements to it, and so it was nice. Every once in a while, I'd look in the crowd, and I'd see somebody holding up a sign saying "Greg Who," which made me feel better. Not as a slight to Greg at all. Just that it just made me feel better, because I know damn well I was, trying to fill some very popular and famous shoes. So
I sent that guy to the gig, so I'm glad I got my money's worth. I gave him $50.
No, I was kidding. A lot for my confidence, believe me.
Well, Jeff Berlin had a similar thing where he played with, all the guys from Yes minus Chris Squire.
Okay.
So it was Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe, and it was Tony Levin's gig, but Tony ate some bad shellfish or something and was sick. The last minute, Jeff Berlin filled in.
I heard about that. Yes,
so it's that same thing where you're looking. There's all the guys from Yes, except Chris Squire. So you're kind of self-conscious about it, and with Troy being Carl Palmer or Jeff being Chris Squire, at least they're the rhythm section, but Greg Lake is like he's the focal point of those songs.
Yeah.
So it's tougher.
Yeah,
for you,
no, that's true. So that's why I was glad that we were doing enough of the original material so that we could say, look, we have our voice too. We're not just playing. We're not a tribute band here. This is.
Right.
And when we did Barbarian, we redid Barbarian, but we wanted to do it differently. I don't like doing things the way that they were originally done, because it's been done that way. There's no reason to redo it. You're not going to do it better than that, so you might as well do it different. Otherwise, there's no reason to redo anything. So, Barbarian, we made it real Bonhamy, on the low end, and a lot more deliberate and rougher and harder, to try and emulate what Keith had done years ago in 1970 and 71 when that album first came out. Kind of what Quentin Tarantino did with Django Unchained. He made the violence in there so far over the top, just like it was with the original with Sergio Leone when they first discovered squibs. It's like at the time it was like, oh my God, that's incredible. So you're trying to elicit a similar impact, but you're going to have to do it in a different way because people are used to that sound now, so you have to do something different to get their attention. So that's what we tried to do.
It's really a lost cause if you just go and try and do an impersonation of someone.
Well, you're just being karaoke then at that point. That's something I've never done.
Another guy I felt sorry for was Trevor Horn. And yes, to the drama tour, because he was fine on the new stuff, and and You and I, some things he pulled off, but the audience wasn't accepting him. John Anderson is so unique and one of a kind.
Well, of course, and there's just certain things that they're just icon songs, and so you have to go a different way so that people know you're not trying to be that person, and that's a hard line to tread, because you have people that are purists that don't want you there in the first place. Other people go, well, let's see what you got.
Yeah, but those purists literally wish it was still 1971.
Yeah,
so
sure.
They'll never be satisfied.
That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But it isn't. So, and you don't have the same guys. And so what you want to do is you want to play to the strength of your team, whatever it happens to be. If, who brings what now? Let's try it different. Let's try it with guitars. Let's see what guitars will do. We didn't have guitars before. Let's, whatever we have to do. Let's make it ours.
Yeah, Greg Lake is a good guitar player, but certainly nowhere near your ability. So, for example, Fanfare for the Common Man, perfect example. You added a whole new dimension to that.
Well, that's what I'll bring to the table, you know, and that's what I'm not trying to do Greg Lake. Nobody can do Greg Lake like Greg Lake. So let if I'm going to be in a position where I'm not being Marc Bonilla, I'd rather be Marc Bonilla in a situation where he's taking someone's place, you know. And so what would he play if that was the case, you know? And that's what you have to do. You don't want to again, you don't want to emulate people. It's been done.
Well, let's talk about your own solo albums where you don't have to be anybody but you. As much as I enjoy the work you've done with all these other talented artists, my favorite stuff in terms of your playing, it's always going to be these. It's hard for me to believe that they're 20 years old because they don't sound dated really in any way. They hold up extremely well.
I'm glad to hear that.
In terms of sound quality and your playing on them, they could be released today and still be ahead of the pack.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that.
Well, in 1991, you released Double E Ticket, and then in 93, you put out American Matador. Let's work backwards and talk about American Matador first. You had some big-name guest stars on it, including Mike Keneally, Toss Panos, Patrick Leonard, who comes up on this show quite a bit. We know a lot of his friends. Lenny Castro and James Newton Howard. Mm-hmm. Amongst all the original material, you did a nice cover version of A Whiter Shade of Pale with Glenn Hughes on vocals, plus a tasty instrumental version as a bonus. You also covered I Am the Walrus with Ronnie Montrose playing slide guitar. You did a virtuoso acoustic track called Prelude. Is that supposed to be your equivalent of Spanish Fly?
Well, yeah, that was actually, that's a Ravel piece. It was Le Tombe de Couperon, which is a piano piece that Ravel wrote for his buddies that were in the war. He never was able to go to war, so he wrote these in tribute to his friends that fought and died there. And this is the Prelude, which is the first part, which is a neck breaker of a piano piece, let alone guitar. So I had to do it I had to split the guitar in half. I had to do 2 tracks of it. And it was a ball buster. It was one of those things. That was the thing on that album that scared me, you know, as far as getting this to work, you know, navigating through. It was very difficult to play, and to get both guitars to sound like one piano track, as it were, was what the challenge was. So, but it was one of the things I'm very proud of, you know, and because Ravel was one of my favorite composers, still is.
You know, that's why I mention it, because it is different from anything else I've heard you do, and that's why I also mentioned Spanish Fly, in the sense that, you know, Eddie Van Halen did all these other things, and boom, here's sort of Eruption on an acoustic guitar, and he never does it again. So, you know, or you know, Michael Schenker, a Bijou Pleasurette or something, you know.
I think we all want to prove to ourselves that we can do it at least once.
Well, when you think of that album, obviously Prelude was unique. What are some of the other tracks that you have memories of being, you know, satisfied with trying something different, or you're just generally happy with how they came out?
Well, I think, you know, Whiter Shade of Pale with Glenn. Glenn had just gotten out of the Betty Ford Clinic, and you know, I've always loved that song, knowing full well that it was a very, you know, one of the rock icons as well. And I thought, if I want to do this again, I need to have somebody that sings it that's got some clout, you know, that people are going to go, oh, well, if Glenn Hughes is singing it, it's got to be good. You know, I certainly wasn't going to do it. And so I had, you know, a friend of mine put me in touch with him, and I called him up, and I said, Glenn, this is Marc Bonilla. I'm sure you probably don't know who I am, but I'm a big fan. You know, Deep Purple is a big fan of Hughes Thrall. I'm, you know, give him the whole spiel, and I asked him if he would sing it, and he goes, and there was a pause. And I thought, oh, boy, he's going to turn me down. And he goes, I was born to sing that tune, mate. You know, so I went, oh, thank God. So he came in. We have film of this. We have all, I mean, I filmed everything in Matador from the beginning to the end. I have all this on film. Someday I'll put it together and release it. But I have him in there performing it, and it would just give you chills to watch him sing. It was just incredible. And so that really was a high point for me, because it was a sense of relief, too, the fact that, wow, now we've got something that really is solid, you know, that is a good remake of something, you know, that you know, and I wanted to do I had done an instrumental, and that's why I decided to put that on at the end, because that was more my voice as far as how I would have interpreted it, you know, so it was just kind of a bonus track on there.
No, I'm glad you did both, because I enjoy both for different reasons.
Well, and it was interesting on that track, too. There was a couple of parts, one part particularly, where I found something out about myself, and that was when we were cutting the lead track. It was Mike Scott was engineering, and we were in Hollywood here cutting it, just he and I in the studio, playing it back, and my fingers did something that I didn't want them to do. They went somewhere else, and I'm like, what are you doing? And it played this lick, and Mike turned to me and went, and mouthed, he went, "That was great. What was that?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't know." But what it did for me, that was a moment where I said, you know what? Something else is at work here. This isn't just me willing my hands to do this. I have a feeling there's somebody else controlling this stuff. And that was the point that I really started to trust whoever my muses were, whoever controls not only my playing but my writing, any of that stuff, to really let the channel come loose and let whoever wants to drive your car, let them drive it.
Wow.
I mean, I used to look at pictures of Woodstock with Hendrix doing Star Spangled Banner, doing all this stuff, and you'd watch what his hands were doing, and then you'd watch his face, because they'd have split screen, and you'd see his face. It didn't look like his face did not translate what he was playing. His face was completely serene, eyes closed, head tilted up towards the heavens, and his hands were just blazing. And it's like, what? He's not there. He's gone. There's somebody else driving this car. And that moment for me, it proved that I could experience that too. And then ever since then, that's what I use as a gauge for expression, is what comes out of me without me thinking about it. And any writer will tell you that, any player will tell you that, if they're in that space, they're in that channeling mode, that they'll come back and listen to a solo. You might have experienced it yourself. Or going back and listen to something you've either played on, performed, or written, and you go, that doesn't sound like me at all. When the hell did I do that? That doesn't sound like something I'd do.
Yeah, hearing you say that, two things come to mind. When I was recording my own album, I did this one particular bend where I wanted to make sure I bent far enough, and I overcompensated, and it sounded really cool, and it got recorded, and then I could never recreate it again on my guitar.
Right.
And
you weren't supposed to. That's the thing. I mean, with every song, you find out any song in your life that you love, there's always one moment where everything is a harmonic convergence. I could name you 1,000 songs right now that I love, and I could tell you the moment I fell in love with that tune. And every time I go back to it, I fall in love with it again. Right at that moment, 2 minutes and 50 seconds in, when Claire Torrey hits this note on Grey Gig in the Sky, where it shakes just right and the bass hits just right, it resonates, and you go, oh God, I love that part right there. And it only has to last 2 to 3 seconds. It doesn't have to be any more than that. But every song that you love has a moment in there where it's like the world is right. And that moment that you're experiencing with a band is something that you're not going to get back. So forget it. Be glad that you got it once.
Totally.
And that somebody was smart enough to have the red light going when you got it. And that's what happened to me on this tune. And Kevin Gilbert taught me that too. On our first album, on Slaughter on Memory Lane, there was a note in there where I slipped off the neck, and I went, let me redo that. He goes, no, you're not redoing that. Because that was perfect. It stuck out. And you're going to hear that every time somebody hears that. They're going to hear that little section. Don't you dare redo that perfect.
Yeah. Well, what I had done is I had done a take of the solo, and I listened back, and I said that one spot, I wasn't happy with what I had done, so that's why I overcompensated. And the second thing I thought of is I actually know a sax player who told me he was soloing at some gig, and he had a moment, it lasted for a little while, where he actually felt like someone else had taken over.
Yeah, you need to surrender to that. That's the key to expression, whether you're writing, whether you're playing, is handing the keys to somebody else and having the confidence to know that they'll take it over. And this is what is the whole key to solving writer's block. There is no such thing as writer's block. It's just your perception of it. Because if you start thinking things come from within you as opposed to through you, then that already cuts it off as a finite source. Whereas if you think it's an infinite number of possibilities, if I just open myself up to it, whatever you want to call it, whether you want to call it God, whether you want to call it universal consciousness, muses, whatever it is, you keep yourself open to that, and it's an inexhaustible source of fuel. And whenever you sit down to write anything, it'll come out. Something will happen. The whole key to writing is writing. The whole key to playing is playing and giving it up and having the confidence to do that and you take chances because someone else is driving.
Yeah, when Bobby Whitlock was on the show, he said essentially the same thing. He doesn't need to sit and think about what to do next. He needs to not sit and think about what to do next, and then it just happens.
Well, the best way to play is to bypass the cerebral organ. You want to go right from the heart to the hands. Yeah. You don't want to go from the heart to the brain to the hands. Because then you're filtering your water. You want it completely unfiltered, and that's what you want. When you start thinking about stuff, then you start doing second takes and third takes. Like, oh no, I can do that. Yeah. I'm always recording, and I record right from the beginning because a lot of times the first take is going to be the best take because that's the one you're not thinking about.
Yeah, a lot of times, the demo has more character
course it does.
than the finished product.
Yeah, there's less brains involved. That's why.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to play one of my favorite tracks on American Matador. Really, really tasty jam. This one is called In the Blue Corner.